Okay, fasten your seatbelts and get ready for takeoff. The emergency exits are located here, here, and here. We continue with the final part of our look at the Americas during the Age of Independence. We've spent a lot of time talking about the U.S. already. Now we'll turn north to Canada and then south from the U.S. to Latin America. And then at the very end, go back and look at the economic and social developments briefly in all three regions. So, as I often do, I start with a quote from our lovable author, uh, Professor Bentley. Canada did not fight a war for independence, and in spite of deep regional divisions, it did not experience bloody internal conflict. Instead, Canadian independence came gradually as Canadians and the British government agreed on general principles of autonomy. By the late 19th century, Canada was a land in control of its own destiny, despite continuing ties to Britain and the looming presence of the United States to the south. Looming is an interesting word there on the choice of Professor Bentley, but I don't think it's incorrect. The United States and Canada weren't friends and allies like we are today. And we'll see kind of what looming basically means. It at least connotes the fact that the Canadians were rightfully fearful or apprehensive about the motives of the United States. Canada's colonial history is long and rich and complex. We can trace it back to at least the first voyage of Jacques Cartier, an explorer in 1534. The first colony of the French laid down in what's now Canada was laid down by Samuel de Champlain, basically the father of New France, and France is the overall name for French colonies in Canada. 3 years later, he founded Newfoundland and Acadia, and this became sort of eventually the larger region of Quebec, or much of it did. In 1670, Hudson's Bay Company was founded. This became a gigantic corporation eventually, mainly trading in furs, a very lucrative commodity in those days. Another milestone event, big time, is 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, when New France ceased to exist because Britain won the 7 Years' War against France, and as they say, to the victor belong the spoils. When you win a war, you get to take stuff from the other side. And the British took French Canada and incorporated it into a British Canadian colony now. In 1783, the year that the American Revolution came to its formal end, Canada took in a fairly large number of loyalists after that revolution. Loyalists were those Americans who had stayed loyal to Great Britain and didn't participate on the side of the patriots, George Washington, Adams, Thomas Jefferson, etc. And Canada was taking some of them in because they were persona non grata in the United States by this time. In 1812 to 1814, the middle of the beginning years of the War of 1812, the U.S. invaded Canada by force, and so keep in mind it was a British colony, but Canada can say that it got invaded by the U.S. In earlier times. And in 1867 comes Canadian independence, or at least autonomy. So, what about the War of 1812? Looking at it from the Canadian perspective, and we barely even look at it from the American perspective in our country, as Bentley also says to us, ethnic divisions and political differences could easily have splintered Canada, but the War of 1812 stimulated a sense of unity against an external threat. The United States declared war on Britain. Despite the greater resources of the United States, Canadian forces repelled American incursions. Their victories promoted a sense of Canadian pride, and anti-U.S. sentiments became a means for covering over differences among French and British Canadians. So you see why the Canadians in those days felt a looming presence of the United States. The U.S. had invaded them in 1812, but they failed. And in one of the many unintended consequences of history, because certainly American forces didn't invade to try to unite Canadians, but that's one of the things that happened. The sense of national pride, nationalism, patriotism. This was a colony to be a country that, again, had lots of reasons to fear disunity, amongst its own populace. But this helped to keep that at bay, at least to a degree and for a time. The British North America Act of 1867. This is the first big step to Canadian independence. At this point, it was autonomy, which is almost independence, but not quite. Looking at the quote below, the British North America Act of 67 joined Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and recognized them as the Dominion of Canada. Other provinces joined the Dominion later. Each province had its own seat of government, provincial legislature, and lieutenant governor representing the British Crown. The Act created a federal government headed by a governor-general who acted as the British representative. Without waging war, the Dominion of Canada had won control over all Canadian internal affairs, and Britain retained jurisdiction over foreign affairs until 1931. So the foreign affairs part of it, and the governor-general appointed by the British Crown, was the way in which this isn't complete independence yet, but autonomy. But for all domestic decision-making and laws, Canada was controlling its own fate from this point forward. And after 1931, that's true of foreign policy as well. Why did Canada successfully sue for independence peacefully when the United States had to fight a revolution to do so? Well, part of this, I think, is the timing. Surely the British had learned from their mistakes and errors of the American Revolution, that there might be better ways to deal with colonies that are eager to acquire independence. In this case, you can see a deal of sorts was struck. Britain retained, again, jurisdiction over foreign policy and got to have one official, prominent member of the government, the Governor-General, as part of the arrangement. They got none of that when they fought to try to keep the United States, within their empire, because the United States broke away free and clear through warfare, without then having the need to conciliate or to sort of make some sort of a concession or compromise. And the Canadian government was structured something like the U.S. government, in that it was a federal system, meaning that the power was to some degree shared between the central government and the regional governments of the various states like Quebec and Ontario and others, as in our federal arrangement, where Washington, D.C., the federal government centered there, has to, in some ways, to some degree, share power with the 50 states of the Union. The complex legacy of John A. Macdonald. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada, and he was controversial then, and he's controversial now. In fact, he's been in the news in fairly recent memory with the whole array of historical figures, statues being torn down, not just in the U.S., but in many places, including Canada. John Macdonald's statues have been a victim of this as well. I'm not commenting on whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. It just is. But it shows you that he still is controversial, mainly because of the way he dealt with Indigenous peoples in Canada, Native Americans, but for other reasons as well. He said famously, "Let us be English or let us be French, but above all, let us be Canadians." Notice he didn't mention Native Americans or the Métis peoples, who we'll talk about. What he left out here might tell us something. But whatever his, drawbacks, whatever we might say in valid criticism of him, he did sort of create a large chunk built the foundations of what became a successful Canada, and in many ways the Canada that we sort of know today, which has been, again, a very successful country, a nice place to live relative to other places to live in the world. Not the only nice place, but Americans tend to give it sort of high marks. Professor Fernandez Armesto, whose masterful world history text talks about this and says, thanks in part to the dynamic vision of the man the British chose to be the first Canadian Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, the Confederation took responsibility for the whole of British North America, incorporated British Columbia on the Pacific coast in 1871, drove rails across the continent, meaning a transcontinental railroad and beyond, and created a state with the potential Canada subsequently came to exhibit, such as a country remarkable for social welfare, cultural pluralism, constitutional flexibility, prosperity, and peace. So, as is true of so many historical figures, it's difficult to come to moral conclusions or even practical conclusions of what he did that benefited Canada and what he might have done that harmed Canada, and then to weigh those in the balance and decide, was he more of a helpful figure or more of a harmful figure to Canadian society then and going forward. I'm not proposing to answer that question. Again, it's complicated, but you can make a reasonable case either way that he was bad. He was a bad guy, did damaging things more than he did good things, or you can make the opposite case. Now we move to Latin America after independence, and quote Marshall Eakin, who's kind of my resident expert on Latin America, saying, in the aftermath of independence, Latin America would still be plagued by political factionalism, regionalism, militarism, social unrest, and economic challenges. Stability, both political and economic, had to be achieved to begin a sustained process of nation building. Even more complicated would be the creation of national communities, what the renowned anthropologist Benedict Anderson has called imagined communities. So what's being said here, to unpack this quote for you, is that there were lots of challenges to the kind of national unity that the United States achieved, that Canada achieved in the Americas. Larger challenges than were faced in those two places. And it was one thing, the quote is also saying, to achieve independence. It was another thing to create cohesive states, sort of national states with the loyalty of the population, a patriotic a sense of loyalty from the population, nationalism, patriotism. Again, Benedict Anderson's an anthropologist, but his expertise is in nationalism, and he thinks of nationalism as imagined, in the sense that it doesn't matter if what the people think that sort of keeps them glued together, keeps them, optimistic and even gung-ho about their society, their country, their nation, is true, as long as it does provide the glue that unites them, together. So that kind of glue was more difficult, the author is saying here, in Latin America. Part of this may have been because it's one of the reasons I believe it is commonly stated as a reason, that keep in mind the Latin American republics, newly independent here, had been Spanish or Portuguese colonies before. And neither of those countries on the Iberian Peninsula in Europe had particularly democratic histories. And so democratic institutions sort of weren't so much sort of in the woodwork, sort of naturally already kind of there in the ethos, the value system, the customs, the political culture of Latin America because of the Portuguese and Spanish influence. And of course, that's different in North America, where the colonial powers there were British, French, and Dutch. Could think of Dutch. And those were all countries that were much more democratic by this time, particularly Great Britain, but the other two as well. So that may have had something to do with any explanation as to how Latin America made moves towards democracy and republican government, at least formally speaking, but didn't get to the point, at least in these years, to the point where it was really could be called successful almost anywhere. There was chronic political instability after independence. The republics in all places notwithstanding, in reality, the de facto leaders ended up being a group called the Cadillos, military dictators or strongmen. And by the mid 1800s, almost all Latin American nations were ruled by such person. A classic example is Juan Vicente Gomez, a ruthless military dictator that ruled Venezuela for about 20 years. He said at one point, "All Venezuela is my cattle ranch." So again, there are other possibilities, and I don't want to belabor the point here, but some of this type of political arrangement whereby the country is run by a dictator might have something to do with the political culture stemming from the Spanish and Portuguese roots in Latin America. The Cadillos themselves, this again became the norm in Latin America. Authoritarian leaders, roughly equivalent to a dictator. We'll make them synonyms, at least for now. But to give you at least a few more of the characteristics of the Cadillos and their leadership, they were usually regional leaders with a loyal base in their sort of home region. So this is important because it's that base that allowed them kind of a foundation and a springboard to larger national power. They tended to be very good at achieving, acquiring popular appeal. The public tended to love them and gave rewards to economic elites, kind of buy them off, because the economic elites weren't necessarily always, at least at first, wild about these guys coming to power. But they played sort of the elites off with the common people. Another way that they kind of used their political ability, charisma in many cases, to sort of maintain a balance, to try to sort of moderate between the interests of the mass of the people, who they were usually popular with, and elites who they were only popular with if they were giving them economic rewards or making business easier for them, looking the other way and allowing them to do business however they wanted to. There also was a tendency towards kind of ultra masculinity among the Cadillos. This is part of sort of the gendered performance that went along with machismo. Right, the word macho comes from that today, but it was a major value amongst leaders, amongst males in general. But leaders felt a perceived need to sort of display their toughness, their tough guy attitude, in order to survive what was clearly a sometimes violent and often usually difficult politics. So they ruled through fear on one side and patronage on the other, which meant they would sort of help you out if you did them favors in return. And you can, I think, see that the patronage part of this could be used, and really kind of is being used here, as a synonym for corruption. So another common feature of the Cadillos is that they tended to be corrupt. Not surprisingly, dictatorships around the world tend to be corrupt. They promised order after long periods of instability much of the time. This is the one feature, I think, of the Cadillos that you could say was a positive for the public at large. They made a lot of appeals to the people and got them on their side. They weren't quite as good at following through and doing things for the public, and managed to somehow keep their loyalty in most cases. But that's probably mostly because people, the average person who's more vulnerable than the rich and powerful during periods of instability, is happy to have somebody that comes along that can just maintain law and order, just make it safe to go outside every day when it hadn't been before. If you can do that in a period, in a country, a place that's has had this kind of reason to fear everyday life for so long, that's something that people grab onto and will think of as that's all we need. Forget about rights and freedom of speech and everything else. This guy's maintaining law and order, and it's keeping me and my family safe from going out, as long as we don't get on the wrong side of the law. Maybe the quintessential example of a Cadillo is this gentleman, Juan Manuel de Rosas. And he ruled Argentina for a few decades, a couple of decades plus, and did so kind of in all the kind of classic ways. He restored order, made him popular with the public. He could be extremely cruel and used fear through violence and threat of violence to get his way and to keep everybody in line following his leadership. He's been referred to as the Machiavelli of the Pampas, or my personal favorite, the Argentine Nero. Nero was a Roman emperor who was seen as very unstable, maybe even seriously mentally ill, and known for his incredible cruelty. So if somebody calls you the Argentine or the American or whatever Nero, it's not a compliment. Just keep that in mind. The road to revolution in Mexico. Mexico is one of the many Latin American countries we're dealing with here. It's the only one we'll deal with in a more specific fashion. But it's a good example of the kind of disjointed politics, lack of the kind of stable republic that you see in the United States and Canada. The War of Independence from Spain came around the same time as the other wars for independence in the rest of Latin America, finalized in 1821. Mexico became a republic shortly thereafter, but then from there, leaders such as Santa Anna and others sort of fought it out for power and ended up becoming dictators at one time or another. I've left out a lot of them here, so it's not overly complicated. The Mexican-American War, a war fought with the United States, certainly had an impact on Mexico's domestic politics and society. And on the other side of that comes a period of liberal rule and what seemed like sort of hope for workable and even modern democratic governments through the Constitution of 1857. La Reforma, as it was known. Benito Juarez, legendary leader, formed mainly a liberal government. The word liberal didn't mean then exactly what it means now, but liberal in the sense at least that it was pushing for, again, reforms that moved in a modern and democratic direction overall. I wouldn't push democratic too far in this case, but overall. French troops occupied Mexico City during the American Civil War, mainly because of debt owed by Mexico to France that it defaulted on. So this caused greater instability domestically as well. In 1877, a leader named Porfirio Diaz formed a conservative government. Again, we don't want to mistake the term conservative, what it meant then, with what it means now. But conservative in sort of a very general sense that the conservatives like Diaz and his followers didn't want change. They were perfectly happy with things the way they were because they tended to be those that were doing really well under the present system. And all of this instability kind of in back and forth of politics was leading to more and more radical politics, did lead to more radical politics, and you get the Mexican Revolution for about 10 years during the early part of the 19th century. Francisco Madero was elected president in 1911. One of the generals of the country, Huerta, took power a couple years later. Then another politician kind of had been in the mix as well, took power only to be overthrown by another general. So here you have military dictators yet again. and in the middle of all that, you also have radical revolutionary leaders like Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, pictured on the left, who were fighting for land reform, fighting to not just land reform, but sometimes redistribution of wealth and ceilings placed on how much property one could own. And though they were defeated, they were both actually killed, and there were other revolutionary leaders as well. Some of their demands for reform, they had a popular base of support amongst average people in much of Mexico, can be seen in the Constitution of 1917. They didn't participate in it. None of the rebel or revolutionary leaders did. But the government that sort of formed or wrote this Constitution put some of that in there, probably wisely. You see Juarez pictured on the right, the guy most associated with La Reforma. Part of the reforms included taking land from the Catholic Church and redistributing it to poor people, some of whom had never had land before. But this was controversial because to traditional Catholics, and there were many of them, sort of messing with the church isn't what they are looking for in government. But if you got land for free or quite cheaply because of this program, even though it came at the expense of the Catholic Church, you might feel differently. You might be torn and ambivalent about it. I don't like what they're doing to the church, but I can't afford not to take the land that they're giving me that they took from the church. The 57 Constitution put forward traditional liberal political ideas, basically freedom of speech, freedom of the press, kind of the basics, but did severely restrict the Catholic Church, at least as part of it, or they believed it was part of it. Porfirio Diaz, already mentioned on the left, Zapata and Villa already mentioned and seen on the right. Diaz sort of had a lengthy period in office, the long peace it's sometimes called, a conservative leader who mainly just kept things the way they were, for good and bad. So corruption that just stayed where it was. But again, some people preferred this to revolutionary times when things were topsy-turvy and was always sort of unstable and brought a lot of fear if you were an average person living in the country. But by the early 20th century, there was more and more sort of unsettled people and who were complaining about this and that, mostly remnants or pieces, I should say, of inequality. About 95% of all peasants before the revolution remained landless. 95% of the population basically remained landless. That's not. I should rephrase that. 95% of all peasants means 95% of all poor farmers. Not everybody was a poor farmer, of course. There were poor people that lived in cities, that worked in factories or shops. So it's not 90% of the population. But that's still a large percent of the population not to own any land whatsoever. So with that number alone, you can see how and why revolutionaries like Zapata got popular following. And the Mexican Revolution, though it failed to take power, the radicals, the revolutionists didn't take power. As we said, it did get written into the Constitution that follows in 1917. But nonetheless, these leaders still were significant. The revolution itself, by the way, probably saw at least 2 million people killed when all was said and done. So this wasn't child's play. This was serious, violent, bloody revolution. The Constitution of 1917, the one we've been referring to here a little bit, went consistent with the previous constitution, stripped more power from the Catholic Church, in this case, by this time, taking away its role in public education. It imposed redistribution of land, imposed certain labor laws as concerned for the work, hours of work for laborers, minimum wage for workers, etc. And so this did move Mexico in an even more liberal direction than the previous constitution about 60 years before this, we already mentioned. American economic development. So now we're looking at economic development in all three places, and then social issues. So the United States boomed economically in the 19th century. The important question of the era, as Wilfred Maclay tells us or believes, would be whether the Constitution was outdated. Was the 18th century document that had been sufficient for the needs of a small, decentralized agrarian republic woefully insufficient for the needs of a major emerging industrial power? That's a question that's even still around to this day. It certainly was into the 20th century. For that's precisely what the U.S. was becoming in the latter years of the 19th century, and it was doing so at breakneck speed. And it was already well underway before the Civil War. If anything, the expansion probably would have occurred even more rapidly without the distractions and distortions of war caused by this distortions caused by the sectional crisis and war. But the plain fact is that something utterly remarkable would happen in the mere 35 years between the end of the Civil War and the end of the 19th century. In 1865, American industrial power was inferior to that of any of the major European powers, but by 1900, the U.S. had become the leading industrial power in the world, as measured by its GNP, total value of gross domestic product, total value of goods and services produced in the whole country, and other measures as well. Samuel Colt, the gun manufacturer that achieved kind of fame and fortune in America before the Civil War, said there is nothing that cannot be made, nothing cannot be produced by machinery. You can make everything with machinery. And in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, the foundations were laid for the economic boom that would come after did I say revolution? The years before the Civil War, in what's called the market revolution sometimes. Getting my terminology confused here. But some historians see the part of industrialization that happened before the Civil War as the first Industrial Revolution and the part that came after as the second Industrial Revolution. Some think of the part that came before the war, the market revolution, as kind of laying the foundations, a prelude to the Industrial Revolution proper after the Civil War. I don't think it matters how you conceptualize that. I actually prefer the latter one, but that's just sort of the one that makes more sense to me. But this was the beginnings of an industrial revolution from small farms and small shops to cities and factories, meaning most goods before the Industrial Revolution were made farms and shops. Now that's changing. The factory system of mass production is coming into being. The Lowell system and the American system. The Lowell system was created by Francis Cabot Lowell, the leading figure in the Boston manufacturers, who were the first kind of major textile producing corporation company in America. So this is private enterprise, capitalism, and they established an entire system, the very organized and systematic, which produced record profits. The whole system included the workforce, primarily young unmarried women at the time, who often worked under very difficult and unjust conditions. The American system was the government's attempt during the presidency, in particular, of John Quincy Adams, son of an earlier president, and his Secretary of State, Henry Clay, guy we've already met as sort of the great compromise guy. And his American system, with the president's support, was an attempt to use federal dollars, taxpayer money, and selling of bonds, taxpayers paid back ultimately, to create infrastructure. So the American system was a series of internal improvements, as they were known then. The government paying for the building of roads and railroads and man-made canals, etc. So this was a way to not move away from capitalism, but to kind of enhance and nudge capitalism in certain directions with the assistance of the government. The Erie Canal, 350 miles long, one of the great products of the early Industrial Revolution in terms of transportation improvements. The steam engine became the workhorse for work and production of all kinds in the Industrial Revolution. We already know that from our unit on the Industrial Revolution globally. Now we're looking at it kind of specifically in the U.S. And the telegraph, which sounds funny today because you've probably seen it in some movies. They tap on a little lever and it makes little beep sounds with a language, Morse code, translated into English and through telegraph wires, electrical currents. But that was the cutting edge technology for communication and information technology at the time. It really was. It sounds funny to say that, but it was. So these are all products of the early or foundations of the Industrial Revolution. There's also a battle over the national bank, Alexander Hamilton's earlier creation, but it had always been controversial, still was. Henry Clay was a supporter of the bank and used it as a presidential election issue and lost the election to President Andrew Jackson. And Jackson and Clay were at odds over lots of things, but including the bank. Jackson wanted to destroy the national bank because he believed it was harmful to average Americans, at least so he said. And he got his way, and the bank was destroyed. And America didn't have a national bank then between the end of the 1830s when Jackson killed it and 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was first created. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is hotly in dispute even today. So industrial capitalism, right? Industrialization under capitalist auspices saw the United States grow into, in a short time, into a world economic power and a fabulously wealthy country, producing huge economic growth. Pictured on the left is the Homestead Steel Mill, owned by Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in American history, and one of the great successes of the economic takeoff of the late 19th century. This represented overall an irresistible pull on capitalists and governments alike. What does that mean? It means once you move into an industrial revolution, you're not moving back. Of course, the capitalists, the successful ones anyway, don't want to go back to pre-industrialization because they're making too much money. They're not all successful, but those that are don't want to go back. Governments don't want to go back because they see quickly that this kind of wealth production, even if it's in private hands, still greatly benefits government and increases government power. I put a steel mill on here for a reason. If the government sees that private businesses like Carnegie Steel are making enormous amounts of steel at high quality and outdoing other countries, among other things, that's of great military interest because you can build more weapons, more ships, eventually tanks and planes that can allow you to intimidate enemies or potential enemies and get what you want in the world. This is why governments don't ever seek to go back and reverse an industrial revolution. Sometimes workers have wanted to, but they're not the ones who have the power, and so they don't get their way. But as part of this kind of economic growth, we see, again, the development of the factory system of mass production. We're already familiar with this on a global, from a global perspective. More and more work done in factories or large facilities instead of shops. Mechanization, more work done by machines, or at least workers tending machines instead of making the commodities themselves by hand or through more primitive machines that still require a great deal of skill and quite a bit of work. Division of labor and assembly line techniques. Each commodity, whether it's a steel bar, or whatever it is, a piece of clothing, a textile mill, is made in stages, each worker contributing only one small part of the whole. So it's sort of assembly line organization. Large infusions of capital are necessary for some of these. Look at that. That's not even all of the Homestead Steel Mill right there, but that's a rather large industrial work there. So imagine modernizing that and buying new machinery, and it costs money. So large infusions of capital were needed for a lot of this economic growth in the U.S. which meant improvements and the growth of banking and finance. It had to expand because there was a need for it. None of this could have happened with Carnegie on the left and others, other businesses, companies, industries like it couldn't have done so without a effective financial industry. Immigration in America's Industrial Revolution. Immigration had been a part of the country for a long time, but there was a mass of people that came from other places between roughly 1880 to 1920, which is sometimes called the new immigration. Not that immigration itself was new, but these were immigrants that were coming from places that they hadn't really before. So before the Civil War, before 1861, most immigrants to the U.S. were European, and Northern and Western European at that. The Irish, the Swedish, the Dutch, the Germans, etc. After the Civil War, you see groups that hadn't come really before and that were really totally foreign to Americans: Russians, Greeks, Hungarians, Czechs, and the first immigrants from Asia, the Japanese and Chinese immigrants. And because these groups were less well known to American citizens, and some of them looked a lot different. Greeks and Italians, for instance, oftentimes having kind of a darker olive complected skin, dark hair, dark eyes. Although that's not what all Italians look like or did even then. But nonetheless, it caused resentment, fear, hatred, prejudice towards them. Also causing, I think, greater prejudice towards this wave of immigration than the one before the Civil War was the fact that new and suspicious from, again, American citizens' perspective at the time, groups were coming with different religions. Catholics from Italy, members of the Orthodox Church coming from Greece, and the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, Jews coming from Poland and Russia, etc. So all of these things met Native Americans with a strong, in some cases brutal, wall of nativism. Nativism is a fear of foreigners or immigrants and a desire to keep them from coming into the country, or forcing them to leave the country. As you probably already know, American history, like British and other industrializing countries' histories, is known for the awful conditions in the early Industrial Revolution: sweatshop immigrant workers in New York City and other places, tenement buildings, which you see on the right, in the big cities, which were apartment buildings, but you had lots of immigrants, and mostly immigrants, people crammed together, sometimes multiple families in one little apartment, very little access to running water, if any at all. They tended to be unsanitary, unsafe, unhealthy, brutal overall. So that immigrants to the U.S. were coming, of course, because they saw opportunity, and oftentimes did get opportunities in which some of them made a great deal out of. Nonetheless, it wasn't easy, and these people were sometimes abused, and certainly had a rough go of it in the early generations, first, second generation to be sure. The transportation and railroad revolution. Railroads had been around before the Civil War, but they took off. And right around the turn of the 20th century, by that time, the United States had more railroad track laid than all European countries combined, which shocked Europeans when they realized how extensive American rail lines were. This has multiple, I think, important features to it. The only one I'll mention here, but I think it's the most important, is that this opened up national markets for the first time, realistically. You can see the transcontinental railroad lines by the 1880s. There were 4 of them, you can see here, but that map doesn't include all the in-between railway lines. There's this whole sort of spider web of railway lines, and this made it realistic for the first time for you to, if you were a business person, owned a corporation making widgets, Now you could realistically think about selling widgets in every state. And increase your production. You have one factory, now you're going to build 2 factories or build 5 new factories. And when it didn't make sense before because you had the money to build them, but there was nowhere to sell all the extra goods, all the extra widgets you'd make in 5 factories instead of 1. But now there is, because you can realistically get it there on time, in a short amount of time, efficiently, which makes it cheaper. And it makes it cost effective and profit effective for you to do so. Looking at now Canadian economic development, what was called the national policy, I think is correctly associated with Canada's economic growth. The national policy did face opposition, particularly from Indigenous peoples who resisted encroachment on their land, especially the building of a transcontinental railroad across Canada through rural areas where Native Americans in some cases had lived for a long, long time. So there's, of course, a lot of similarities between Canada's development and the U.S. There's a move west here from the East Coast across the Great Plains all the way to the West Coast, and some violence, some problems, particularly with Native Americans who want to hold on to keep their land, and but the government and settlers coming from further east want the land. So some of the same conflicts, some of the same issues. But Canada did experience a boom in agriculture, and particularly minerals, and a mineral-rich country, gold, silver, copper, etc. Tapped their own rivers for hydroelectric power to build a strong manufacturing base at the same time. So Canada's economy started sort of picking up rather quickly as well. They weren't as far along in industrialization, certainly not nearly as big as the United States by the time we say get to the 20th century, but they were already on the way to kind of becoming a wealthy country through industrialization. Economic development in Latin America was much more difficult. The political instability we've already noted certainly has a lot to do with it. Without political stability, it's hard to have functioning markets and to achieve and sustain economic growth. So I won't get into the reasons why. I would, but we don't have time. It was only in the last third of the 19th century, as Eakin tells us, that liberals in Latin America assumed power just about everywhere, and most of Latin America began to open up to international trade and enter fully into the Atlantic economy. Many economic historians point to the lost half-century between independence and insertion into the international economy as the primary reason for Latin America's slow economic growth and underdevelopment in the 20th century. And that certainly is not the factor I just mentioned, but it is, I think, another factor, and that too many of the Latin American countries didn't really participate, at least in a large way, in international trade until quite late in the game. And it put them behind, and in some cases so far behind they didn't catch up afterwards. But I would argue here that the author is saying something else that's in line with what I just said myself. Part of the reason the Latin American republics didn't engage in international trade, at least on a large scale, is because of their political and sort of social instability. We see, however, a lot of potential in Latin America. Trade and commerce in places like Argentina was sort of bigger than in some of the others. Very lucrative crops like coffee production in Central America, which you see pictured on the right. So there was a lot of potential, some of it, untapped or relatively untapped. Now let's talk about issues of social diversity. All of these regions of the Americas had to deal with rather extreme issues with regard to ethnic, cultural, and racial issues. On the left, you see the Carlisle Indian School, where quite controversially now, wasn't as controversial then, but horrifying to us now to see little Native American children forced to go to schools that basically taught them how to be white and to kind of give up their traditional culture and to fit into the mainstream American white culture. And the teachers and reformers that were involved in these kind of projects, like the Carlisle School, their intentions were actually good. I'm not saying that gets them off the hook for what they did, which we find odious today, but they, in most cases, believed that they were helping these children to have better lives, whether or not, whether that was true or not. On the right, you see a picture of an African American man voting during Reconstruction in the South, but voting rights were temporary at that point for at least Southern blacks. Once Reconstruction ended, they went away for quite some time. And there's lots of issues here with social diversity, since there are Euro-American settlers, some of whom, as we've already seen, were discriminated against, African-American workers, growing numbers of migrants from not just Europe but Asia. So we know there's been lots of turmoil and prejudice and racism in the country throughout its history. So we're touching on something here that most of us already know, but we do need to constantly keep it in mind. Ethnic diversity in Canada maybe wasn't quite as big of a problem as in the US, but it was still a pretty big problem. On the right, you see pictured Louis Riel, a Métis leader. The Métis were Canadians who were half European and half Indigenous, or half Native American. And their rights were often abused during this period. And Louis Riel became kind of their hero and eventually their martyr. He raised actually an army to fight against the Canadian push to the west, which affected the Métis and the Indigenous, and eventually fought the Northwest Rebellion, where he led a large military force to try to stop the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. But fighting against the government can get you into big trouble, especially when your revolution or insurrection fails. And Riel was tried for treason, found guilty, and executed. And as Bentley says, his fate reverberated throughout Canadian history. Reverberated, seen again as a martyr by many, not just Métis and Native Americans. Many people of all sort of backgrounds saw Riel as a figure, a heroic figure in many ways. And ethnicity and identity and gender in Latin America. Eakin tells us that in a region where white Europeans and Euro-Americans were a minority, in some cases a tiny minority, and where the vast majority of the population was composed of non-European peoples, Native Americans, Africans, and their racially mixed and culturally mixed descendants, the task of constructing a sense of national identity as Mexicans, Peruvians, Brazilians, Argentines, etc., would be complicated and complex as constructing effective political and economic systems. So here in Latin America, you see a real a diverse mix of peoples, and there were issues and problems there as well. There was also the issue of male domination in Latin America, which isn't to say that that wasn't true in the other societies as well. We know it was, but it was maybe heightened a little bit because of the value system of machismo, which we mentioned before. And the idea that the culture in some ways was fairly strongly leaned very strongly in the direction of a culture of sort of male strength and even sort of aggression. And the women often, of course, took the brunt of this. They were barred from legally having sort of public influence, politics, etc. There really was no significant women's movement at the time. So as difficult as life was for American women trying to achieve their rights, start a women's movement, it was harder to do in Latin America. Not that it never came, but more difficult at this time.